The sun-scorched plains of Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under the blazing August heat of 1876. But Teresa Galloway's thoughts were consumed not by the sweltering temperature, but by the pain shooting through her injured ankle and the dwindling water in her canteen. What had begun as a simple trip to visit her ailing aunt in Sweetwater Springs had turned disastrous when her horse had spooked at a rattlesnake, throwing her to the hard-packed earth before bolting away with most of her supplies. Teresa wiped sweat from her brow and limped forward, wincing with every step. The town was still miles away, and her strength was fading fast. Her ankle, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, protested with sharp, stabbing pains that brought tears to her eyes. The saddlebag containing her remaining possessions, a few dollars, a change of clothes, and her aunt's medicine grew heavier by the minute. "Lord help me," she muttered, searching the horizon for any sign of life. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked from the sun and lack of water. Teresa had lived in the West long enough to know the dangers of being stranded without a horse. She'd left her father's homestead early that morning, expecting to reach town by midday, but now the sun was beginning to dip, and the prospect of spending the night alone on the prairie filled her with dread. When she spotted a dust cloud in the distance, Teresa felt her heart leap. She waved frantically, hoping whoever was approaching would see her. As the rider drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, moving at a steady pace. The rider slowed his horse as he approached. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten Stetson pulled low over his eyes. When he tipped his hat back, Teresa saw a pair of keen blue eyes studying her with concern. "Madam," he greeted, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Looks like you've found yourself in a spot of trouble." "My horse threw me and ran off," Teresa explained, her voice cracking from thirst. "I've been walking for hours." The cowboy nodded, reaching for his canteen. "Name's Ross Ewing. I'm heading to Sweetwater Springs. Here, drink this." Teresa accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips as she'd been taught. "Teresa Galloway. I'm trying to reach Sweetwater Springs as well. My aunt is ill." Ross surveyed her condition with a practiced eye, noting her swollen ankle and exhausted state. Without a word, he took the heavy saddlebag from her shoulder. "You're in no condition to walk all that way, Miss Galloway," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Come on, just lean on me. We'll get you up on Storm here and I'll walk alongside." "I couldn't possibly impose," Teresa protested weakly, even as she found herself leaning against his solid frame. The relief of having someone to share her burden was overwhelming. "No imposition at all," Ross replied, securing her saddlebag to his saddle. "Can't leave a lady stranded on the open range. That wouldn't be right." With careful movements, he helped her mount his horse, a magnificent gray stallion that stood perfectly still throughout the process. Once Teresa was settled, Ross took the reins and began leading the horse toward town. "Thank you," Teresa said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Ross glanced up at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I suppose." As they traveled, Teresa learned that Ross was a rancher with land about 20 miles north. He had business in Sweetwater Springs with the bank and was planning to stay a few days before heading back to his ranch. "What about you?" he asked. "You mentioned your aunt is ill." Teresa nodded. "She's got the consumption. Doctor says she doesn't have long. I'm bringing her medicine from the doctor in Laramie, though I doubt it'll do much good at this point." "I'm sorry to hear that," Ross said sincerely. "Family's important out here." "She raised me after my mother died," Teresa explained, feeling a sudden need to share with this kind stranger. "My father and I have a homestead near Laramie, but Aunt Martha is all alone now." Ross nodded in understanding. "It's good of you to come to her." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and purple, Ross decided they should make camp for the night. Teresa's ankle needed rest, and pushing on in the dark would be dangerous. He helped her down from the horse with gentle hands and set about making a small campfire. From his saddlebags he produced jerky and hardtack, which they shared alongside the last of his coffee. "This is mighty kind of you, Mr. Ewing," Teresa said as she sipped the strong, bitter coffee. "Ross, please," he corrected with a smile, "and it's no trouble. I wasn't raised to leave folks in need." In the flickering firelight, Teresa could better see his features. He was handsome, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a good nature, but there was a seriousness to him as well. His hands were calloused from hard work, his skin tanned from days spent under the unforgiving sun. "Have you always been a rancher?" she asked, curious about this man who had come to her rescue. Ross leaned back against his saddle. "No, madam. I was a cavalry scout during the war. Afterward, I drifted for a while, worked as a trail hand driving cattle up from Texas. Saved every penny until I could put a down payment on my own spread." "That's admirable," Teresa said. "Building something from nothing. What about you? Always been a homesteader?" Teresa shook her head. "I was born in St. Louis. My father moved us west after my mother died. He thought a fresh start would do us good." She smiled wryly. "I was 12 and hated everything about it at first: the isolation, the work, the constant threat of drought or blizzard or grasshoppers eating our crops. And now?" Ross asked, his eyes intent on her face. "Now I can't imagine living anywhere else," she admitted. "There's something about this land that gets into your blood." Ross nodded in agreement. "That it does." They fell into companionable silence, the crackling fire and distant howl of coyotes the only sounds disturbing the quiet night. Teresa found herself stealing glances at Ross, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought him into her path just when she needed help most. As the night deepened, Ross insisted Teresa take his bedroll while he kept watch. Despite her protests, she was asleep within minutes, exhaustion finally claiming her. The next morning, Teresa awoke to find Ross already up, coffee boiling over a fresh fire. He'd fashioned a crude compress for her ankle using his bandana and water from a nearby creek. "This should help with the swelling," he said, carefully wrapping her ankle. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-roughened hands. "You seem to know what you're doing," Teresa observed, wincing slightly as he secured the compress. "Picked up a few things during the war," Ross explained. "Learning how to patch up injuries quickly becomes necessary when you're miles from a doctor." After a simple breakfast, Ross helped Teresa back onto his horse. Her ankle felt slightly better thanks to the compress, but she knew walking any distance would be impossible. They continued toward Sweetwater Springs, Ross walking steadily beside the horse. He entertained Teresa with stories of his ranch and the characters he'd encountered during his years as a cattleman. She found herself laughing more than she had in months, momentarily forgetting the gravity of her aunt's condition and the pain in her ankle. By midday, they reached the outskirts of Sweetwater Springs. The small town was bustling with activity wagons rolling down the main street, shoppers moving between establishments and cowboys loitering outside the saloon. "Where does your aunt live?" Ross asked as they entered town. "She has a small house at the end of Pine Street," Teresa replied, pointing toward the east side of town. Ross led the horse through town, ignoring the curious stares of locals wondering why a man was walking while a woman rode his horse. When they reached Aunt Martha's modest clapboard house, Ross helped Teresa dismount and supported her as she hobbled to the door. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a thin, elderly woman with the same auburn hair as Teresa, though hers was streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun. "Teresa, good heavens, child, what happened to you?" Aunt Martha exclaimed, her concern evident despite the weariness in her voice. "Had a bit of trouble with my horse, Aunt Martha. This is Ross Ewing. He rescued me when I was stranded." Aunt Martha's shrewd eyes assessed Ross before she nodded approvingly. "Well, Mr. Ewing, you'd better come in. Seems I owe you my gratitude for bringing my niece safely to me." Despite her illness, Aunt Martha insisted on making them tea while Teresa settled on the sofa with her injured foot elevated. Ross seemed uncomfortable at first, his large frame out of place in the dainty parlor, but soon relaxed as Aunt Martha drew him into conversation. "So you have a ranch north of here?" Aunt Martha asked, settling into her rocking chair with a cup of tea. "Yes, madam. Nothing too grand, but it's growing. Just bought another 100 head of cattle last month." "Building something worthwhile takes time," Aunt Martha said with approval. "My late husband always said that anything worth having is worth waiting for." Teresa noticed a faint blush creep up Ross's neck at her aunt's words, and she felt her own cheeks warm. "Well," Ross said, setting down his empty cup, "I should be getting on to the bank before it closes. Miss Galloway, it was a pleasure to be of assistance." "Mrs. Reynolds," Aunt Martha supplied, "but you must call me Martha. Mrs. Reynolds, thank you for the tea." Teresa felt a surprising pang of disappointment as Ross prepared to leave. "Mr. Ewing, Ross, I can't thank you enough for what you've done." Ross tipped his hat. "Just glad I was there to help, Miss Galloway." "Teresa," she corrected softly. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Teresa, then." After he left, Aunt Martha fixed Teresa with a knowing look. "That's a good man there, Tess. Not many would go out of their way like that for a stranger." "He was very kind," Teresa agreed, trying to sound nonchalant as she busied herself with retrieving the medicine from her saddlebag. "MMHMM," Aunt Martha hummed, not fooled in the slightest. "And handsome too, wouldn't you say, Aunt Martha?" Teresa exclaimed, but couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. The next few days passed in a blur of caring for her aunt and resting her ankle. The local doctor confirmed it was a sprain rather than a break and advised her to stay off it as much as possible. Teresa sent a telegram to her father explaining the situation, and received his blessing to stay with Aunt Martha as long as needed. She hadn't expected to see Ross again, assuming he would have concluded his business and returned to his ranch. So when a knock came at the door 3 days after their arrival and she opened it to find him standing there, hat in hand, she couldn't hide her surprise or pleasure. "Ross, I thought you'd have headed back by now." "Had some business that took longer than expected," he explained, though there was something in his expression that made Teresa wonder if that was the whole truth. "Thought I'd check in, see how you and your aunt are faring." Teresa invited him in, noticing how his eyes immediately took in her improved mobility. "The doctor says I should be back to normal in another week or so." "That's good news," Ross said, genuinely pleased. "And your aunt," Teresa's smile faltered. "The medicine helps with her comfort, but—" She trailed off, not needing to say more. Ross nodded in understanding. "I'm sorry." Their conversation was interrupted by Aunt Martha shuffling into the parlor, her face lighting up at the sight of Ross. "Mr. Ewing, what a pleasant surprise." Ross stood respectfully. "Madam, just wanted to see how you both were doing." "Better for seeing a friendly face," Aunt Martha declared, settling into her chair. "Teresa's been fussing over me like a mother hen. It's good to have someone else to distract her." "Aunt Martha," Teresa protested, embarrassed. But Ross just laughed, a warm, rich sound that made something flutter in Teresa's chest. "Happy to be of service, madam." To Teresa's delight, Ross began stopping by regularly over the next 2 weeks. Sometimes he brought small gifts, fresh baked goods from the town bakery, wildflowers he'd picked on his rides, or books he thought Teresa might enjoy. Other times, he simply offered conversation and company, a respite from the heavy atmosphere of illness that pervaded the house. During one of his visits, Ross offered to help Teresa send another telegram to her father and to check if her runaway horse had been found. While in town, they stopped by the general store for supplies, and Ross insisted on carrying everything despite Teresa's protests that her ankle was much improved. As they walked back to Aunt Martha's house, Teresa found herself studying Ross's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She'd met many men during her 22 years, but none had affected her the way Ross did, with his quiet strength, gentle manner, and unexpected moments of humor. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ross asked, catching her staring. Teresa blushed. "I was just thinking how fortunate it was that you happened along when you did." "Fortunate indeed," Ross agreed, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he looked away. That evening, after Ross had departed with a promise to return the next day, Aunt Martha fixed Teresa with a pointed look over her knitting. "That young man is sweet on you, Teresa." Teresa nearly dropped the dish she was drying. "Aunt Martha, really, he's just being neighborly." "Neighborly?" Aunt Martha scoffed. "He's extended his stay in town for nearly 2 weeks when his ranch needs tending. He brings you gifts and looks at you like you hung the moon. If that's being neighborly, then I'm the Queen of England." Teresa couldn't help but smile at her aunt's bluntness. "Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, I'll be returning to Father's homestead soon. Ross has his ranch miles away. It's hardly practical." "Practicality has little to do with matters of the heart, my dear," Aunt Martha said softly. "When I met your Uncle Henry, he was passing through on his way to California, planned to try his luck in the gold fields. 2 weeks later we were married, and he never did make it to California." Her eyes took on a faraway look. 42 good years we had together, never regretted a single day." Teresa sat beside her aunt, taking her frail hand. "That was different. You and Uncle Henry were young and in love," Aunt Martha finished for her. "Not so different at all, I'd say." The next day, Ross invited Teresa to join him for lunch at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in Sweetwater Springs. Teresa accepted, assuring Aunt Martha she would be fine alone for a few hours. The restaurant was surprisingly elegant for a frontier town, with white tablecloths and real silverware. Ross had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and newly polished boots, his usually unruly hair tamed with pomade. "You look beautiful," he said as he held her chair, his eyes appreciative as they took in the simple blue dress she'd pressed for the occasion. "Thank you," Teresa replied, feeling a flutter of nerves. "You look quite handsome yourself." The meal was the finest Teresa had eaten in months: roast beef, fresh vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. Throughout lunch, their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from books they'd read to their hopes for the future. "I want to make my ranch something special," Ross confided as they lingered over coffee. "Not just another cattle operation, but a place that contributes something to the territory. I'm experimenting with different breeding stock, trying to develop cattle that thrive in our harsh winters better than the longhorns." Teresa listened, captivated by his passion and vision. "That sounds wonderful. Father's always said the future of Wyoming depends on innovative thinking like that." "What about you?" Ross asked. "What do you want for your future?" Teresa hesitated, uncertain how to answer. "I've always helped Father with the homestead. I suppose I assumed that would continue until—" She trailed off, embarrassed to mention marriage so directly. "Until you had a home of your own," Ross supplied gently. Teresa nodded, meeting his gaze. "Yes, though finding the right partner out here isn't always easy." "No," Ross agreed, his blue eyes intent on hers. "But sometimes the right person comes along when you least expect it." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility, until their server arrived with the bill, breaking the spell. As they walked back to Aunt Martha's house, Ross grew uncharacteristically quiet. Teresa wondered if she had said something wrong or if he regretted his implied admission. At the gate to Aunt Martha's yard, Ross stopped and turned to face her. "Teresa, I've been meaning to ask," he paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Would you consider writing to me after you return to your father's homestead?" Relief and joy washed over Teresa. "I'd like that very much." Ross's face broke into a wide smile. "Good, that's good." Before Teresa could respond, the front door flew open, and Aunt Martha's neighbor, Mrs. Bennet, appeared looking distraught. "Teresa, thank goodness you're back. It's your aunt. She's taken a turn for the worse. The doctor's with her now." Teresa felt the blood drain from her face. Without a word, she hurried into the house, Ross close behind her. The next few days were a blur of worry and exhaustion as Aunt Martha's condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctor could do little but administer morphine for the pain, and Teresa maintained a near-constant vigil at her aunt's bedside. Through it all, Ross remained a steady presence, bringing meals, running errands, and simply being there to offer support when Teresa felt she might collapse from fatigue. He never intruded on the private moments between Teresa and her aunt, but was always nearby when needed. On the fifth night, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Aunt Martha opened her eyes and beckoned Teresa closer. "Teresa," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you must promise me something." "Anything, Aunt Martha," Teresa replied, tears streaming down her face. "Promise me you won't let fear hold you back from happiness. Life is too short for regrets." Her gaze drifted to the doorway where Ross stood, keeping a respectful distance. "That young man cares deeply for you, and I can see you care for him too." "Aunt Martha, please don't strain yourself," Teresa pleaded, but her aunt shook her head weakly. "I've lived my life, child. Now I want to know you'll live yours fully." She squeezed Teresa's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me." "I promise," Teresa whispered, pressing a kiss to her aunt's forehead. Satisfied, Aunt Martha closed her eyes. She passed peacefully in her sleep that night, with Teresa holding her hand until the end. The funeral was held 2 days later in the town's small cemetery. Despite having been in Sweetwater Springs only a short time, Ross had arranged everything, sparing Teresa the details in her grief. The entire town turned out to pay their respects to Martha Reynolds, a testament to how well-liked she had been. As people began to disperse after the service, Ross stood quietly beside Teresa at the grave. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done. I don't know how I would have managed without you." Ross took her hand gently. "You're stronger than you know, Teresa. But you don't have to be strong alone." In the days that followed, Teresa began the difficult task of sorting through her aunt's belongings and preparing the house for sale. To her surprise, Aunt Martha had left her a small but significant sum of money enough to make a difference in Teresa's future, whatever she decided that would be. She always was a prudent woman, Teresa told Ross as they sat on the porch swing one evening, a week after the funeral. Uncle Henry left her comfortable, and she never spent more than she needed to. "What will you do now?" Ross asked, his shoulder warm against hers in the cool evening air. Teresa sighed. "Father expects me back at the homestead. I sent him a telegram yesterday saying I'd be leaving next week once everything is settled here." Ross nodded, his expression unreadable. I see. They sat in silence for a long moment before Ross spoke again, his voice hesitant. Teresa, I know this might seem rushed, especially considering recent events, but I can't help feeling that if I don't speak now, I might lose my chance. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. From the moment I saw you on that trail, something told me you were special. The more I've come to know you, the more certain I've become. Teresa's heart pounded in her chest as Ross continued. I have to return to my ranch. There's cattle to tend, decisions to make about the coming winter, but I don't want to go without telling you how I feel. His blue eyes were earnest, vulnerable. I care for you deeply, Teresa, more than I thought possible in such a short time. Ross, Teresa began, but he gently squeezed her hands. You don't have to say anything now. I know you're grieving and you have obligations to your father. But I want you to know that if you were ever inclined to consider a future that included me and my ranch, I would be the happiest man in Wyoming Territory. Teresa felt tears welling in her eyes, but these were different from the tears of grief she'd shed so frequently of late. I care for you too, Ross, very much. Relief and joy spread across his features. Then may I write to you, and perhaps when the time is right, come to speak with your father. Teresa nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. Yes, I'd like that. Ross raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. That's all I ask for now. The next morning, Ross helped Teresa load the last of her aunt's personal items into the wagon she'd purchased for her journey home. Her ankle had fully healed, and though sadness still weighed heavily on her heart, there was also a newfound sense of possibility. I'll be leaving tomorrow as well, Ross told her as they stood in the quiet house that had become so familiar over the past weeks. Need to get back to the ranch before the first snow. Teresa nodded, fighting against a fresh wave of emotion. Will you write as soon as you get there? Just so I know you arrived safely, of course, Ross promised. And I hope you'll do the same when you reach your father's homestead. That evening, they shared a quiet dinner at the hotel restaurant where they'd had lunch weeks before. The atmosphere was different now, tinged with both sadness at their imminent parting and anticipation of what might come. As they walked back to Aunt Martha's house under a canopy of stars, Ross took Teresa's hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. May I call on you at Christmas? He asked. It's only 3 months away. I could make the journey to Laramie then, meet your father properly. Teresa felt a surge of warmth at the thought. I'd like that very much. Father always makes a special effort at Christmas, despite being alone for so many years. I think he'd welcome the company. At the gate, Ross turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Teresa, I want you to know I'm not asking for any promises now. When I come at Christmas, we'll have time to talk about the future, about what we both want. But until then, he leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Teresa felt her breath catch as his lips met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief but perfect, a promise of possibilities to come. When they parted, Ross rested his forehead against hers. Something to remember me by, he murmured. As if I could forget, Teresa replied softly. Their farewells the next morning were bittersweet. Ross helped Teresa secure the last of her belongings in the wagon and checked that her newly purchased mare was properly harnessed. You have the map I drew, he confirmed, ever practical despite the emotion of the moment. Teresa patted her pocket. Right here, and enough supplies for twice the journey. Ross nodded, satisfied with her preparations but clearly struggling with letting her go. If you encounter any trouble, I'll be fine, Ross, Teresa assured him, touching his arm gently. I've made this journey before, remember? Yes, and ended up stranded with a sprained ankle, he reminded her with a rueful smile. which turned out to be the luckiest accident of my life, Teresa countered, her eyes holding his. Ross's expression softened. Mine too. With one last embrace and a kiss that lingered longer than propriety might allow, they parted, Ross heading north to his ranch, Teresa east toward Laramie and her father's homestead. The journey home gave Teresa ample time to reflect on the whirlwind of the past month, the pain of losing Aunt Martha tempered by the unexpected joy of finding Ross. She thought of her aunt's final words, urging her not to let fear hold her back from happiness, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Upon reaching the homestead, Teresa was greeted enthusiastically by her father, who listened with interest to her tales of Sweetwater Springs and the kind rancher who had come to her aid. "Sounds like a good man," Richard Galloway commented after hearing how Ross had stayed to help through Aunt Martha's final days. "You say he's planning to visit at Christmas?" "Yes, if that meets with your approval," Teresa replied, trying to sound casual. Her father's knowing smile told her she hadn't succeeded. "I look forward to meeting the man who has my daughter blushing at the mere mention of his name." The autumn months passed in a flurry of activity as the homestead prepared for winter. Throughout it all, letters traveled regularly between Teresa and Ross. His were full of details about his ranch, his plans for expansion, and always references to how much he missed her and looked forward to seeing her at Christmas. Teresa cherished each letter, reading them by lamplight in the evenings and carefully composing her replies, sharing her daily life and gradually revealing more of her hopes and dreams for the future, dreams that increasingly included him. When December arrived, bringing with it biting winds and occasional snow flurries, Teresa found herself counting the days until Ross's promised visit. She baked and cleaned with renewed energy, much to her father's amusement. "If I'd known a gentleman caller would inspire such domesticity, I'd have arranged one years ago," he teased as Teresa hung fresh curtains in the parlor. "Father!" Teresa exclaimed, but couldn't help laughing. In truth, her father's support meant everything to her. Since returning home, she'd shared more of her growing feelings for Ross, and Richard Galloway had listened with the patience and wisdom that had guided her throughout her life. "All I want is your happiness, Teresa," he told her. "If this Ross Ewing is the man to provide that, then he'll have my blessing." The day before Ross was expected to arrive, a fierce blizzard descended upon the territory. Teresa stood at the window, watching anxiously as snow piled high against the fence posts and visibility reduced to mere feet. "He won't travel in this," her father said gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No sensible man would." Teresa nodded, knowing he was right but unable to quell her disappointment. "I know, I just hope he's somewhere safe." The storm raged for 2 days, howling around the sturdy cabin and forcing them to stay close to the fire. By the time it finally subsided, leaving a pristine white landscape in its wake, Christmas Eve had arrived with no sign of Ross. "Perhaps after the new year," her father suggested as they sat down to a simple Christmas Eve supper. "Once the roads are passable again." Teresa nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course." It was foolish to expect a loud knock at the door interrupted her words. Father and daughter exchanged surprised glances before Richard rose to answer it. When the door swung open, there stood Ross, snow-covered and red-faced from the cold, but smiling broadly at the sight of them. "Mr. Galloway, I presume," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Ross Ewing." "I apologize for my delayed arrival. The storm forced me to shelter at a way station for 2 days." Richard Galloway shook the offered hand firmly. "No apology needed, Mr. Ewing. We're just glad you made it safely. Come in, come in." Teresa was beginning to worry. As Ross stepped into the warm cabin, His eyes found Teresa's, and the joy in them made her heart soar. He had come despite the blizzard, despite the dangerous conditions. He had come because he'd promised he would. "Merry Christmas, Teresa," he said softly, removing his hat as snow melted from his coat onto the wooden floor. "Merry Christmas, Ross," she replied, unable to stop the wide smile spreading across her face. "You must be frozen through. Come sit by the fire." That Christmas Eve became the first of many the three would share. Over steaming cups of cider and plates of Teresa's cooking, Ross and Richard Galloway discovered a mutual respect and genuine liking for one another. They talked late into the night about ranching, the changing territory, and eventually, with Teresa pretending not to listen from the kitchen, about Ross's intentions toward her. The next morning, after a festive Christmas breakfast, Ross asked Teresa to join him for a walk despite the cold. Bundled in coats, scarves, and gloves, they trudged through the snow-covered yard to the small copse of trees at the edge of the property. "I have something for you," Ross said when they reached the shelter of the pines. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Teresa accepted it with gloved hands, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a simple gold ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Ross explained, his breath fogging in the cold air. "My father gave it to her when they came west, a promise of the life they would build together." Teresa looked up at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Teresa Galloway, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you, a good life, filled with purpose and joy." He took her gloved hand in his. "Will you marry me?" Tears of happiness filled Teresa's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Ross, I will marry you." Ross's face lit up with such joy that Teresa couldn't help but laugh through her tears. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace before setting her down gently and kissing her a kiss full of promise and future and home. They were married the following spring in Sweetwater Springs, in the same church where they had said goodbye to Aunt Martha. The town turned out in full force to celebrate the union of the respected rancher and the woman he had once found stranded on the prairie. After the ceremony, as they prepared to depart for Ross's ranch, their ranch now, Teresa placed a bouquet of wildflowers on her aunt's grave. "I kept my promise, Aunt Martha," she whispered. "I didn't let fear hold me back." As she rejoined her husband by the waiting buggy, Teresa reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together: a spooked horse, an injured ankle, a chance encounter on a lonely trail. What had begun with weakness and pain had blossomed into strength and joy. "Ready to go home?" Ross asked, offering his hand to help her into the buggy. Teresa looked up at him, this man who had once carried her saddlebag and told her to lean on him when she couldn't walk alone. Now they would walk through life together, supporting each other through whatever came their way. "Yes," she said, taking his hand. "I'm ready."